In September 1786, a meeting was held of all of the states and addressed the multiple weaknesses and lapses in the central government related to its relationships to the states, its legislature, its executive leadership, and its economic policies. The result was a petition for a meeting in May of 1787, which would be the Constitutional Convention. Now, most of the delegates were in favor of a stronger central government. Now, they were in favor of this stronger central government largely because they recognized how difficult it had been for the colonies to be effective during the Revolutionary War. And so they favored a stronger central government, but there really wasn't any agreement on the structure of this central government or how strong it should be. They agreed that it should be stronger than the Articles of Confederation and it should not have complete control like a king. But there is a lot of room in between those two. Many of the delegates, including George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, were very strong nationalists, and so they sought a powerful central government. Now, Hamilton went much further and actually supported a monarchy. Now, this is ironic, right? We have just fought the Revolutionary War to gain independence from a monarchy, but Hamilton comes along and says, hey, let's have another monarchy. Now, Madison and Wilson favored a more democratic format based on popular support. But some of the delegates were totally against any national authority, and several of the delegates from New York actually left. At the start of the convention, Edmund Randolph from James Madison's Virginia delegation was ready to present 15 resolutions proposing fundamental changes to the national government. Now, again, the issue surrounding this constitutional convention is largely how much government should we have? So the first plan we're going to discuss, and there were several that were presented, we're going to focus on just a few. The first plan is a plan sponsored by Edmund Randolph, and it's called the Virginia Plan. Now, this plan was based on a bicameral legislature with power concentrated in the lower chamber chosen by the people. Now, this might sound familiar. This is very similar to the House of Representatives. That House of Representatives would then choose an upper chamber, like a Senate, and the legislature would elect an unspecified national executive and appoint a judiciary. But representation would be strictly based on population, so this would be a disadvantage to the smaller states. So again, this Virginia plan ultimately says that the people in each state will elect representatives. Their representatives will appoint what is ultimately like a Senate, a smaller but higher chamber. And then the legislature, the Senate and the representatives would get together and choose a national executive, kind of like a president. And then they would appoint a judicial area for government. But again, because this is based on population, states where you have smaller populations, states like Georgia, states in the western areas, even some of the smaller states like Maine and the northern parts would not receive a lot of representation. But states like New York, Virginia, New Jersey, some of those states that had large populations would actually retain a lot of power. This concerned the delegates or the representatives from each of those smaller states because their concern was that they would be giving up power and voice in their government. Now, the New Jersey plan is sponsored by a man named William Patterson. And this plan maintained a one state, one vote structure, which was already in place with the Articles of Confederation. Now, several people would comprise the executive office to be elected by Congress. So Patterson is advocating for not a president, but sort of presidents, an executive where they would need to make decisions together. The Congress would also appoint a Supreme Court or a judiciary. Now, the New Jersey plan was simply an amendment or an adjustment of the Articles of Confederation, but it did feature a supremacy doctrine, which gave priority of national law over state laws. Now, that's important because that will be included later in the Constitution. Now, you can probably see why this plan as its own entity wasn't very popular. The concern here again is that those larger states with larger populations have the same vote as states with smaller populations, and so they did not feel that that was ultimately fair. Another concern was how anything could be accomplished if you had this executive group rather than an executive individual. So ultimately, they end up with what they call the Great Compromise. And this is really the work of Roger Sherman from Connecticut, who proposed a compromise between the large states with a lot of population and the smaller states, which wanted the New Jersey plan. So the Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise, proposed a bicameral legislature. This is two houses or two legislatures in Congress. One chamber would be based on population. This is called the House of Representatives. The other would be based on equal representation for each state. That, of course, is your Senate. Now, this plan broke the deadlock between the large states and the smaller states because each state received what they believed and considered to be fairer representation. Now, although the equal representation in the Senate diluted the power of the heavily populated states, they felt that they were still fairly represented because they had more members in or in the House of Representatives. As this great compromise is being mapped out, other issues come to light in how the individual states are different, not only in terms of population, but in terms of their economy and their makeup within the individual states. So many of the delegates had questions and doubts about slavery. Many of the delegates wanted to ban slavery altogether. Delegates from the South, led by Charles Pinckney from South Carolina, opposed the ban, and they wanted slaves to be counted in determining representation in Congress. Now, the North objected to this because this would actually increase the representation of Southern states. Not all Northern states represented objected to slavery. Slavery existed in many of the northern states just as it did in many of the southern states. The concern was, the fear was, that those states in the South that had large numbers of slaves on plantations would actually end up with a lot of influence. So the Three-Fifths Compromise was suggested by Sherman to prevent the Southern states from leaving the convention. And it provided that 3/5 of the slaves would be counted, or each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person. And as a result of that, Southern states could increase some of their participation and their representation in the House of Representatives, but they couldn't necessarily achieve as much as they would like. Now, it is important to understand that as a result of this, the Southern states also had to ensure that taxes were paid to the federal government or the central government on those slaves. So there was a perceived benefit for the southern states because they were able to count slaves for representation purposes, but there was also a benefit for northern states because they were able to tax the slaves on that 3/5 clause as well and increase the revenue coming into the central government. Now, the matter of slavery, the issue of whether or not slavery should or shouldn't be legal, was to be put off until after 1808. Now, whether the framers should have banned slavery rather than accept compromise has been debated by historians since this particular time. That would be a really good question on an exam. Several other issues came up at the Constitutional Convention. The one issue was the issue of the agricultural South. And as a result, export taxes were banned. The delegates mandated a Supreme Court, with both the President and the Senate choosing its members, and allowed Congress to ultimately establish lower courts. A small committee of detail was appointed to finalize the work. The draft suggested that the executive and the judicial branches would be subordinate to the legislative branch or to the Congress. Now, with this Madisonian model, we see the concept of separation of powers. The delegates were so concerned with structuring the government to prevent the imposition of any form of tyranny. They were very focused on making sure that the judiciary or the executive or the legislature could not become a supreme authority. Madison suggested that the legislative, the executive, and the judicial powers focus on different tasks equally but independently, referred to as the separation of powers. The Madisonian model offered a three-part structure in which no branch could dominate the other. The term checks and balances means that each of the three major powers can check and confront the other two. So an example of that is that Congress can enact a law, but the president can actually veto that law. Over the years, this has evolved into kind of a give and take where Congress gets something, but they have to give up something. The president might get something, but will have to make some concessions in other areas. Suggestions for a plural executive or a congressionally appointed executive was ultimately rejected. Instead, the Electoral College was created so that the president would not be chosen by Congress, but not by direct popular vote either. Again, the concern here was that we as Americans wanted to ensure that no entity could become more powerful or more tyrannical than another. A summary of the fundamental principles to be formally approved included popular sovereignty, a republican government, a limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, and the allowances for states' rights to avoid too much centralized control. The September 1787 signing by 39 of the original 55 delegates began this ratification debate. Here we can see, just with this example, the judiciary, the various ways that Congress and the president can check that judiciary. Again, the final document included popular sovereignty, Republican or representative government, limited government because we have written laws, and separation of power, and then a federal system that allowed states to operate relatively independently so that they were not subjects of a larger executive. Now, the founders realized that some of those states were very resistant. Some of those states were resistant because they were very concerned about tyrannical governments. Some of them resisted because they had been relatively successful as independent states and were unwilling to give up their autonomy. When we hear the term states' rights, we usually think of the Civil War, and we think of that as a negative term, but states' rights was really about ensuring that the federal government wasn't too powerful. Two opposing forces really battled one another over the ratification of the Constitution. Now, the delegates had agreed that as long as 9 of the 13 states approved the Constitution, it would take effect. And so these Federalists and Anti-Federalists began working to raise awareness in the individual states about the various sides of drafting and approving this Constitution or rejecting this Constitution. Now, remember, in order for this to be approved, the individual states have to agree. So the Federalists were in favor of a strong central government. They supported the Constitution as it was. The Anti-Federalists wanted to prevent this newly drafted Constitution from being ratified because they felt that it decreased the rights and freedoms of the people under their individual states because there wasn't anything outlined specifically that would protect the rights and the freedoms of the people. Now, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay quickly wrote 85 essays that were widely published. Those essays were called the Federalist Papers, and those Federalist Papers attempted to persuade the public to support the new form of government. Today, they are considered perhaps the best example of political theorizing in U.S. history. If you read Federalist number 10, which is in your book, you will see the features of Madison's classic political theory concerning the nature of groups or factions. He viewed the Anti-Federalists as a faction that were seeking to undermine the central government. But the Anti-Federalists responded, and they issued very brilliant attacks on the Constitution, claiming that it would lead to an aristocratic tyranny, that it would lead to overbearing central government. And patriots like Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams argued the viewpoint of French philosopher Montesquieu that the Republic worked only in small societies or networks of small districts. These Anti-Federalists believe that we can't truly be the way that we have decided we want to live if we give up power as individual states. One of the fears, the concerns, of course, was that people would lose rights because they would be giving up their rights to this central government. Here we see Patrick Henry addressing the Virginia Assembly, and the question that you should start thinking about is, why were these anti-federalists so opposed to the Constitution that they had supported until it was drafted? Now, New Hampshire was the 9th state to approve the U.S. Constitution, and with their approval, the Constitution was ratified. So the first state to ratify the Constitution was Delaware. This was a relatively small state, and they ratified the Constitution on December 7th, 1787. The next state was Pennsylvania, which did have a large population, on December 12th. On December 18th, New Jersey ratified the Constitution, also a large state. In January of 1788, Georgia, who initially had that unicameral legislature, ratified the Constitution. On January 9th, 1788, Connecticut ratified the Constitution. February 6th, Massachusetts. April 28th, Maryland. May 23rd, South Carolina. And finally, New Hampshire on June 21st, 1788. A question for you to begin to think about is the other states that have not ratified yet: Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. What was the holdout for those states? Why were they not as eager as the first 9 states? The Federalists had promised that they would add some amendments to the Constitution solely for the purpose of protecting individual liberties from the central government. Now, most of the Federalists believed that this was unnecessary, but the Anti-Federalists had raised enough concern that the Federalists knew that if they did not make this concession, that they would never get this Constitution to be passed. And this is one of the few times in our nation's history when two groups on opposite sides of an issue actually really achieve a compromise and then stand true to their word. Madison reviewed hundreds of suggestions from various states and drafted the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, called the Bill of Rights. Now, it was drafted in December of 1791 and became part of the Constitution. And it provided protection of the fundamental rights of the people. But it did not include equal protection under the law, and it did not limit state power. Only the national government was restricted until the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War. Now, it is important that you think about these amendments, these Bill of Rights, and what it would mean to you today in 2020, the coming years, to not have freedom of speech, to not have a right against self-incrimination, to not have the right to not be unlawfully detained. So what those Anti-Federalists were advocating for in this Bill of Rights are things that we today view as synonymous with the Constitution, but they weren't a part of the original Constitution. Now, the founders intended that the Constitution be a framework for the new government and that it would be open to future interpretation. So it was really kept to about 7,000 words, and it remains brief because the amending procedure doesn't allow for easy change. It was designed to prevent tyrannical or oppressive additions. Amendments can be proposed by 2/3 of the vote in each chamber of Congress, so 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. Changes can also be proposed by a national convention, although that method has never actually been used. And then amendments can be ratified. Congress has considered more than 11,000 amendments, but only 33 have been submitted and only 27 have ever actually been ratified. To have any chance for success, amendments and recommendations must have very, very, very wide support. Now, there are some informal methods to constitutional change. And again, it's very difficult to actually amend the Constitution, meaning that it has changed through various interpretations based on growth in population and territory and on political and social realities. Congress, presidents, and the courts have all interpreted the Constitution over time. Though it doesn't specifically define them, the Constitution does give Congress broad powers to regulate foreign and interstate commerce and to establish the federal courts. And though not specifically authorized in the Constitution, presidents have proposed bills, sent troops to combats, and conducted foreign affairs through executive agreements. And again, though not specifically mentioned, judicial review is the power of the courts to declare a law or an action to be unconstitutional. This was claimed by the Supreme Court in Marbury versus Madison, which we'll learn more about later. This allowed the court to adapt the Constitution to the changing situations. So, for example, wiretapping or collecting data from internet searches today. Those were not things that the framers would have been aware of. So as time goes on and technology increases, social and cultural changes take place, we see that the Constitution changes to those situations. The Constitution is open to interpretation and change, and Congress has delegated specific tasks to the president and the executive branch, eventually involving hundreds and millions of employees. Political parties have great influence over the makeup of Congress and the election system. That brings us to the end of chapter 2.